I haven't worn the uniform in almost 6 years, but the muscle memory never leaves. Even now, I still find myself scanning the room like a technician during pre-dive checks. Eyes sweeping corners, ears tuned to background noise, fingers twitching with impulses to adjust dials that no longer exist. I live in a one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks inland from the harbor in Astoria, Oregon, where the fog rolls in like a living thing every morning, and the gulls scream like they know something no one's willing to say aloud. I keep the curtains drawn most of the day, not because of the sun, God knows it barely shines here, but because I can't look at open water anymore. The thought of it, the endless weight of it, turns my stomach in ways I don't know how to explain to people. Sometimes I try. Sometimes I tell them I used to be a sonar technician for the Navy, one of the best. I served 12 years, worked aboard 3 different attack submarines, trained with DARPA tech teams on prototype signal recognition algorithms, and could distinguish the acoustic fingerprint of a Chinese Type 093 nuclear sub from over 30 nautical miles out, blindfolded. I don't say that part, of course. It sounds like bragging, and besides, it doesn't matter now. Not after what happened. Not after Nevada. I've stopped trying to explain the fear. It isn't panic, not exactly. It's not even PTSD, though that's what the military psychiatrist wrote on my discharge summary. It's more like a persistent internal pressure, something coiled behind my ribs that tightens whenever the barometric pressure drops. I feel it in my teeth, in my spine, like something is listening for me the way I used to listen for them. Quiet, patient, waiting to see if I'd flinch first. I never did. Not until that last mission. The one I'm not supposed to talk about. The one I was told never happened. Back then, I was stationed out of Pearl, recently reassigned to a vessel that didn't appear on any public fleet registry. USS Nevada. The second one. Not the battleship lost during the atomic tests. This Nevada was black budget. Seawolf-class hull reworked with experimental tech and an engineering crew that operated like ghosts. No formal commissioning, no brass band send-off. Just a quiet night departure under a veil of plausible deniability. Even among sailors, there were rumors. Some said Nevada was being used to map uncharted tectonic fault lines in the Pacific. Others claimed it was part of a long-range surveillance program, sniffing out Chinese underwater drone activity. The truth was, no one really knew. Orders came from above the admiral chain. Offices that signed in with initials and didn't return calls. All we knew was that once you were assigned to Nevada, you stopped asking questions. And when you came back, if you came back, you didn't speak. I got the call up in early March. Short notice, but not unusual for my rate. Sonar techs with my clearance level were scarce, and Nevada had lost someone, either to transfer or disappearance, no one would say. I was told to report to Ford Island within 48 hours with all mission gear and documentation. No family contact, no cell phones, no questions. I packed light. 1 duffel, 3 changes of uniform, a folder containing my updated qual records, and the medal I'd stopped looking at years ago. I almost didn't bring it. But something in me felt like it should be there. Like it would be the last time I'd carry anything that still connected me to the world I thought I understood. Boarding Nevada was unlike any deployment I'd done before. She was docked in a dry sector of the yard, out of view from the main harbor, guarded by MPs who didn't wear rank insignia and asked no names. The boat itself looked wrong. Same profile as a Seawolf, sure. But there were changes. Additional thermal venting ports along the aft hull, a reshaped sail with recessed antennae pods, and what looked like reinforced bow plating. The hull number was painted over in matte black. No flag, no nameplate. Just a silent thing asleep in its cradle, waiting to be swallowed by the sea again. Inside, Nevada was colder than any boat I'd ever served on, both in temperature and atmosphere. The crew moved like shadows, disciplined, efficient, but silent. No jokes, no banter. Just nods and clipped affirmations. I met the XO first, a man named Forrester, who had the sharp edges of a lifelong submariner, but the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He didn't shake my hand. Just scanned my ID and said, "Welcome aboard. Captain will brief you when we're underway." That was it. No welcome, no rundown, no buddy system. Just a narrow bunk in a stateroom that smelled faintly of rust and bleach, and a locker with a tag that read, Thompson. We left port at 300. No fanfare, no radio check-ins. slipped beneath the surface and into the dark like a thing being reclaimed by its element. It was only once we hit 1,000 feet that the captain summoned us to the briefing room. His name was Alden. Late 50s, white-haired but wiry, with a stare that belonged to someone who'd learned long ago that fear wasn't useful. The room was small, windowless, dominated by a central table with a backlit projection screen that displayed nothing but black coordinates and a series of shifting sonar patterns I didn't recognize. Alden wasted no time. "This is not a standard surveillance mission," he said. "We've been redirected by Naval Research Command on orders that come directly from Strategic Deepwater Assets Division. We are not here to engage, intercept, or observe. We are here to locate and confirm the existence of a structural anomaly at a depth previously considered unreachable by manned vessels. You will refer to it only as the passage." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I remember the pressure in my chest tightening. It wasn't the depth. It wasn't the cold. It was something else. Something about the way Alden said the word passage. Like it wasn't just a location but a concept. A transition point. A border. He continued, showing us sonar snapshots that made no sense. Geological formations with symmetry. Echoes that looked like structures. Voids where the signal should have bounced back. "We believe the passage is artificial," he said. "Possibly ancient. Possibly predating human civilization. Our task is to reach the entry point, deploy a probe team, and gather acoustic, visual, and magnetic field data. If successful, Command will authorize Phase 2. That's all you need to know." That's all we were told. No theories, no origins, no history. Just a set of coordinates somewhere deep in the Pacific Trench system, near a segment of the ocean floor that hadn't been mapped since the Cold War. My job was to man the sonar arrays and interpret data as we descended. But even then, before we left the safety of the upper zones, before we lost contact with Surface Command, before we heard the first sound that wasn't meant for human ears, I knew we were heading towards something we shouldn't have touched. And I knew, deep in my gut, that I wasn't coming back the same. We all thought we were going to find something ancient. None of us expected it to still be alive. The first 48 hours of descent were a blur of routine cloaked in silence. In any other deployment, those initial days would have been filled with drills, chatter in the mess, bets over time to target, and the low rumble of tension that eventually gave way to familiarity. But aboard Nevada, everything was subdued, like we were passengers rather than crew, like the boat itself didn't want to be disturbed. Even the reactor seemed quieter, its soft electrical hum absorbed by something thicker than steel and seawater. I spent most of my time in the sonar bay, calibrating the passive arrays and verifying acoustic profiles that made less and less sense the deeper we went. We'd left behind the familiar textures of ocean life, dolphin clicks, surface vessels, thermal shifts, and entered a range of silence I'd never heard before. Not an absence exactly, but a kind of smothering blankness, as if the ocean itself had become reluctant to carry sound. By the third day, my shift patterns had synchronized with the deeper systems of the vessel. The newer sonar suite installed on Nevada was unlike anything I'd used before. The engineers had called it neuromorphic processing, hardware designed to mimic the way the human brain interprets chaotic data. The idea was that instead of showing you raw waveforms, the system would learn from your classifications, refining what it showed to prioritize novel or unidentifiable signatures. On paper, it was supposed to reduce operator fatigue. In practice, it made you feel like the machine was listening back. Late in my second shift, while running sweep tests across our portside hydrophone array, I caught a flicker. Not a contact. A flicker. A recursive blip with no origin point and no decay. Like an echo that had never been caused. It repeated 3 times, evenly spaced at 1194 seconds apart. Then silence. I logged it, flagged it for review, and moved on. I told myself it was an artifact, a glitch, probably just equipment settling into its deeper pressure thresholds. But even then, I knew. My gut had started to churn in that way it always did when something real and dangerous had brushed up against the edge of our awareness. The official mission briefing came at hour 72. We were called back to the wardroom, this time in smaller groups. No full assembly, no mission-wide communication. Just 6 of us, key personnel, brought in like surgical instruments. Captain Alden stood at the forward screen again, but this time there was no projection. Just a folder. A single manila folder that he opened with the same care I'd seen nuclear weapons officers use when inputting launch codes. Inside were photographs. Grainy, monochrome stills that looked like they'd been pulled from deep-sea exploration reels half a century old. He laid them out one by one. The first showed a curved structure, like a rib, but made of something that reflected sonar like volcanic glass. The second was worse. An aerial composite of a trench wall carved with straight lines and what looked like alternating nodes. The third showed symbols. Not markings, not coral growths. Symbols, etched deep into stone or alloy or something in between. Their edges unnaturally precise, too sharp to be eroded by ocean current or time. These were taken in 1987 by the USSR, Alden said. Classified reconnaissance project in the Southern Pacific. The vessel that captured these images was lost 6 hours later. The Soviet government declared it a test malfunction. We've only recently acquired the original reels. He handed me a magnifier. I examined the third photo, and my skin crawled. The symbols were geometrically sound but not familiar. Impossible patterns that suggested meaning without offering comprehension. They made you feel like you should know what they meant, like you'd seen them in a dream or on the underside of your own bones. One of them appeared to rotate when I shifted my hand. I had to put the image down before my breath started catching. This is what we're here for, Alden continued. We've tracked the anomalous readings to a subduction anomaly near the Tonga Trench. It's not listed on civilian bathymetric charts. We believe it's shielded, possibly intentionally, from satellite detection. But seismic activity and magnetic field interference have been traced to a point less than 100 kilometers from our current course. That's where we're going. That's where we'll find the passage. He said it again. The passage. And the word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. No one repeated it. No one asked what was on the other side. We knew better by then. Alden passed out individualized instructions. Mine included recalibration parameters for the sonar system at crush depth conditions, and a sealed envelope marked Phase 2 Contingency. I was ordered not to open it until direct command was given. It sat in my bunk locker for the remainder of the journey, untouched but never unnoticed. That envelope became a kind of heartbeat in the corner of my vision, a waiting thing. After the briefing, I returned to my station and ran a localized sweep centered on the coordinates we'd been given. The neuromorphic processor produced a topographic model in real time, and what emerged was impossible. The ocean floor bent in ways that didn't correspond to tectonic plates. A crescent-shaped gouge carved into the earth, like something massive had once impacted and embedded itself, forming concentric ridges around a central depression nearly 3 miles across. At the deepest point, well below crush depth for even military deep-sea drones, there was a shadow. Not a gap in data. A shadow. It absorbed signal. No return ping. No reflectivity. As if the ocean itself refused to acknowledge its presence. I ran the model again. Same result. That night, the dreams started. They weren't nightmares in the usual sense. No blood, no drowning, no screaming faces. Just pressure. The sense of something immense moving overhead in the dark. A limb, maybe. A wing. A ridge of bone or metal or something ancient, gliding through blackness so total it extinguished thought. I woke up soaked in sweat, jaw clenched, unable to remember whether I'd been asleep at all. The other crew members wouldn't speak about it, but I saw it in their eyes. The same fatigue, the same hollow pauses in the middle of sentences. Whatever that shadow was, it had begun reaching upward. Not physically, not yet, but perceptually, psychologically. It had found us before we had found it. The next day, the signal returned. Same interval, 1194 seconds. But this time, there was modulation, frequency shifting, like someone, or something, was tuning itself to match our listening range. The pattern formed a spiral in the spectrograph, not random noise, a recursive helix, like a key waiting to be turned. I should have reported it as anomalous data. I should have followed protocol, but something in me didn't want to call it in. Not yet. It didn't feel like an error. It felt like an invitation, or worse, a reply. By the end of the 4th day, we began descent toward the trench. The ship creaked in protest as we passed depths no manned vessel had sustained for long. The hull integrity monitors were green, but Dave, the chief engineer, kept watching the readings like they were lying to him. Maybe they were. Instruments can be calibrated. Intuition can't. And all of us, even the officers who wore their tension like medals, felt it building. The sense that we were approaching not just something unknown, but something that had been deliberately hidden. Not buried, not lost. Hidden. And for the first time in my career, I stopped believing that sound traveled in straight lines. Because whatever was at the bottom of that trench wasn't just waiting. It had already begun listening. I'd studied underwater acoustics long enough to know that the ocean spoke in layers. Not languages, but patterns. Thermal gradients, salinity profiles, Doppler shifts and reverberation tails that turned sonar into a kind of symphony if you knew how to listen. Every signature told a story. Whales had long, mournful songs. Vessels hummed with mechanical rhythm. Even geological activity had its own cadence. Fractures groaning like old bones, vents releasing bursts of heat and bubbles in staccato flashes. And so when the signal returned for the third time, I wasn't surprised by its regularity. I was terrified by its wrongness. Nothing in the sea speaks with such precision. 11.94 seconds. Not a millisecond off. A waveform so clean, so measured, that it felt surgical. It wasn't sound traveling through water. It was a statement being delivered. The signal didn't reflect. That was the first anomaly. Normally, when we ping something, even passively, the return data gives us mass estimates, density differentials, structure classification if the AI is tuned right. But this didn't give us that. It wasn't bouncing. It was emanating. Like a lighthouse beneath the seabed, casting pulses upward not for communication, but for discovery. That was the word that settled into my gut as I watched the display bloom with harmonic artifacts and phase echoes that shouldn't exist at that depth. Discovery. Not ours. Theirs. Whatever was down there wasn't trying to be found. It was finding us. Dave joined me at the console, frowning at the spectrogram as I looped the recording again. He didn't ask questions, just watched in silence, the flicker of the screen painting sharp shadows across his tired face. "We're getting magnetic field disturbances in the reactor room," he said eventually, voice low, like he was afraid the sonar would hear him. "No source. Power fluctuations, readings that spike when the signal hits. Doesn't affect function, but it's like something is breathing through the hull." I knew what he meant. Not literally, of course, but the sensation that something vast and invisible was pressing against the skin of the vessel, exhaling slow and long into our structure, as if our submarine wasn't intruding into the deep, but being absorbed by it. I logged the anomaly and filed it under Tier 3 threat analysis, even though it didn't meet the formal criteria. That designation would flag it for encrypted review by Mission Command without triggering alert protocols. A precaution. A coward's compromise. I told myself it was prudence, that jumping to conclusions would only accelerate our descent into whatever madness we were slowly spiraling toward. But the truth was, I didn't want to explain what I was hearing. Not yet. Not when the part of me that still believed in logic was losing its grip on the framework that made sense of sound. Alden summoned senior crew to a secondary briefing 12 hours later. We were 30 nautical miles from the trench wall. Depth, 31,000 feet. Far below safe operating parameters, even for a hull like Nevada's. Yet the boat showed no stress fractures, no warning lights. Only the ambient creaking that sounded more like conversation now, the metal groaning in low, yawning tones that seemed to synchronize with the signal, like it was echoing us. Or learning us. The captain was pale, jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched beneath his skin as he addressed us. "The signal is real," he said. "It's not geological. It's not electromagnetic interference. It has pattern, modulation, and source stability. We've traced it to a point 46 miles inside the trench wall." He tapped the map. "Right here. Coordinates match Soviet data from '87. It's the same place." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The word had already begun circulating among the crew, the passage, spoken in half-whispers behind closed doors, like a nursery rhyme no one wanted to admit they remembered. There was something in the air, a pressure you couldn't measure but felt behind the eyes. Men moved slower, ate less, smiled less. I began to recognize the look in their faces from old photos of climbers taken before fatal summits. Not fear, not quite, but the certainty that something final awaited them, and the knowledge that the only way to avoid it was to turn back. Except we weren't turning back. Not when the signal was growing stronger. That night, I stayed in the sonar bay alone. The pulse had shifted again, subtly. The interval remained steady, but the frequency range had narrowed, folding into a tighter band. More focused, more efficient. It wasn't broadcasting now, it was targeting. The array's neural net tried to classify it and failed. Geological, no. Biological, no. Artificial, indeterminate. I bypassed the limiter and ran the waveform through an experimental harmonic interpreter we'd installed as part of Nevada's upgrade package. It was designed to filter random noise for embedded subpatterns, essentially a translator for acoustic gibberish. What came back wasn't a translation, but a waveform overlay. A helix. Spiral nested within spiral. Fibonacci ratios nested so deeply within the signal architecture that it formed a recursive feedback loop. Nature doesn't do that by accident. Nature doesn't even try. But intelligence does. Intelligence leaves fingerprints. The moment the overlay rendered, I felt the change. The air pressure in the room dropped a fraction. My ears didn't pop, but they tingled, as if the pressure was shifting not outside my head, but inside it. I looked around. Nothing had changed, and yet every sound, every distant footstep, every hum of circuitry, sounded sharper, more exact. I realized I was hearing the decay curve of background noise. The silence had gained texture, as if something was now listening to me the way I had been listening to it. I shut the program down and backed away from the console, hands shaking, throat dry. The walls felt too close, the pressure too personal. By morning, the whole ship felt different. The lights seemed dimmer, the metal colder. Conversations were clipped, fragmented. Crew members stopped mid-sentence, as if forgetting what they were saying, or to whom. I passed one sailor in the galley muttering rhythmic counts under his breath. 11, 11, 12, 11. Pause. When I asked if he was okay, he looked at me like I was a stranger, like he didn't know what a question was. They pulled him from the shift rotation a few hours later, citing fatigue. The signal never stopped. It only got closer. That evening, we passed the 33,000-foot mark. Below us, the trench wall yawned like a wound in the planet's skin, its mouth lined with basalt and pressure fractures that flickered with unnatural sonar echoes. Nevada slowed, propulsion reduced to minimal thrust. We were drifting now, descending not with purpose, but with ceremony. The signal no longer felt distant. It was inside the hull. I heard it through the floor plates. I felt it in the soles of my feet, the low, measured beat of something that had been asleep for a very long time. Not dormant, not dead, just waiting for someone to listen long enough to be heard. In my quarters, the sealed envelope pulsed under the red emergency light, untouched but no longer inert. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say. We'd crossed a line, one we didn't understand, one that had been drawn long before we ever dreamed of submarines, or nations, or language. We weren't discovering anything. We were being summoned. The descent began with no ceremony, no speeches, no final orders, no countdown to mark the moment we crossed into what came next. There was only the hum of machinery, the faint chatter of oxygen processors, and the groan of the hull shifting under pressures that would crush any other vessel ever built by human hands. We dropped past 35,000 feet in near silence, our instruments dimmed to conserve power, our communications limited to internal channels. Outside there was no light, no movement, no sound but the throb of our own presence. A solitary thing drifting downward into the blackest regions of a planet that had never known sunlight. The trench opened before us like a throat, the walls jagged with formations that bent sonar like mirrors, deflecting pings into impossible angles, refracting echoes into spirals. Nothing about it obeyed natural logic. Our charts were rendered obsolete before we even reached the entry point. Depth markers became meaningless. The pressure here wasn't just physical, it was ideological. A challenge to everything we believed about the sea, about the earth, about time. It pressed on your chest, not from outside, but from some terrible awareness nested behind your ribs, as if the act of entering this depth summoned something dormant in your own biology. I watched the sonar displays in growing unease. The signal had changed again, no longer just a pulse. It was layered now, complex in its modulation, folding in and out of harmonic ranges that didn't exist in our catalogs. The spectrogram resembled a language that had forgotten how to be spoken, a script etched not in syllables, but in pressure fluctuations. The intervals remained exact, unwavering, as though the source had no concept of imperfection, or perhaps no tolerance for it. We tried modeling the waveforms through our acoustic interpreter, but the results returned patterns that repeated only under inversion, as if they were meant to be heard in reverse. Dave suggested running them backward through the neuromorphic processor. I told him, no, not yet. Some instinct warned me that if the signal was a message, then its structure wasn't for us to decipher. It was designed for something else, something already listening. At 37,000 feet, the lights flickered. Just for a moment. Enough to cause a ripple in the crew. Nevada had been stable until then. Silent, yes. Tense, always. But operational. The flicker changed that. It was as if the darkness outside had pressed itself against the vessel, trying to remind us that it was still there, still watching, still waiting. I checked the ambient light levels and saw a spike. That made no sense. At this depth, there should be nothing. But our sensors recorded a faint luminescence. Non-directional, soft, barely above baseline, but present. The source? Unknown. It didn't pulse. It shimmered. Like the reflection of something vast shifting far below, its light bleeding through the cracks in a reality that had started to fracture. Mitch, our navigator, reported anomalies in our position. Not drift, exactly. Displacement. The inertial systems began to show inconsistent readings. Gyroscopes faltered. Depth indicators jittered by hundreds of feet, then stabilized without explanation. It was as though Nevada was no longer descending in a straight line, but being pulled along a path we couldn't measure. Not falling. Following. I asked Mitch what he saw when he overlaid the navigation chart with the geological data from the trench. He didn't answer right away. Then he simply said, "It's not a trench." I looked. He was right. The formation we were inside wasn't natural. The walls formed too many right angles, the floor too smooth, the curves too precise. There were striations along the edges, deep gouges that ran parallel for miles, like claw marks or the remnants of an impossible machinery. We passed 38,000 feet, then 39. The crew no longer spoke unless absolutely necessary. Breathing was shallow, eyes dull, movements minimal. Time had begun to unravel. Watches showed inconsistent durations. Shifts felt longer, or shorter, or both. I'd blink and find hours had passed, or seconds. The signal, however, remained constant. Every 1194 seconds, like the ticking of a watch that belonged to something beyond death, beyond measurement. I began hearing it outside the sonar bay, in my quarters, in the mess. Once I woke up and realized I was tapping my fingers against the bed frame in perfect time with it. Not consciously, not deliberately. I was syncing with it, like the rest of the crew. Slowly, involuntarily, being tuned to its frequency. At 40,000 feet, we lost all external contact. The last message from the surface was a routine telemetry ping. After that, nothing. Static. No response from command. No handshake protocols. Nevada became the only point of reality in a volume of darkness that swallowed radio like a sponge. The sea had closed over us completely. There was only what lay ahead. Only what waited. Captain Alden gathered the senior crew one last time. No projection screen now. No folders. Just the quiet thrum of the engines and the signal still ticking in the background like a countdown we weren't supposed to notice. He looked more tired than I'd ever seen him. Paler. Older. As though the weight of the mission had begun to calcify in his bones. "We're approaching the anomaly," he said. "Whatever it is, we'll be within range of direct observation in the next 12 hours. Prepare systems for Phase 2. That was it. No elaboration. No call for questions. The envelope in my locker no longer pulsed. It felt warm to the touch, though the room was cold. I opened it that night. Inside was a single line of instruction, printed in black on a gray card. It read, "Do not transmit. Do not speak. Do not break eye contact." I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't want to. I returned it to the envelope and sat in silence, feeling the pressure build outside the walls. Not just the pressure of the sea, the pressure of something near. In the sonar bay, the signal changed again. This time, it split. One pulse became 2, then 3. Each harmonized with the other, forming a low, droning chord that resonated deep in my teeth. It wasn't random. It wasn't a glitch. It was music. No rhythm. No melody. Just a presence. I ran it through every filter I had, and one by one the displays stopped responding. Not shut down. Refused. As if the system knew it wasn't supposed to analyze this. As if something in the signal had rewritten the logic of the machine to protect itself from comprehension. Then the light returned. Not inside. Outside. Faint, undulating currents of luminescence curled along the trench wall, outlining ridges and angles and glyphs I couldn't explain. They moved like phosphorescence, but weren't biological. They weren't chemical. They pulsed in harmony with the signal. They weren't reflecting light. They were the light. The entire trench was beginning to glow. Patterns emerged, geometric symbols etched into the stone, glowing as if blood had begun to flow through the rock itself. It wasn't a passage. It was a threshold. We hadn't found it. It had opened for us. It wasn't a sudden moment, not a switch flipping or an alarm sounding, but a slow recognition that seeped into every crevice of the vessel. That we were no longer surrounded by ocean, but enclosed by something else entirely. The walls of the trench had receded behind us without fanfare, and in their place rose structures too vast to comprehend. Not merely rock or sediment, but the deliberate shaping of matter into form, order, and intention. We had passed into a void, but it was not empty. It was engineered. The sonar arrays, despite their tuning, no longer returned traditional data. Instead of echoes, they sent back silence, an absence that wasn't void, but refusal, as though sound itself had entered a space where it was no longer welcome, no longer capable of doing what it was born to do. What returned were fragments, half-shapes, soft corners, pulses that weren't reflections but emanations, internal, bleeding outward from within the formation itself. There was a structure, enormous, spherical in parts, angular in others, suspended like a cathedral at the axis of the abyss. It was embedded into the seabed in a way that made no geological sense, as if it had fallen there, or grown up from beneath. The crew began to whisper the word again, though none of us had ever heard it spoken aloud. The door. No one questioned what it meant. The truth had bypassed language. We felt it before we understood it. We were looking at an entrance. The lighting outside intensified gradually, as though we were being allowed to see, not merely perceiving by our own sensors, but being shown, revealed to, offered a glimpse. And in that glow, shapes became clearer. Pillars stretching into darkness. Lines carved into stone or metal or something between the two. Symbols, repeating in fractal sequences, some barely a centimeter across, others the size of bulkheads. Every edge was too clean, every angle too purposeful. No erosion, no growth. This place had not decayed. It had not endured time. It had simply waded through it. The sonar couldn't map it. The navigation systems failed to lock position. Time drifted, minutes stretching or collapsing depending on where we stood inside the ship. Dave began manually logging reactor data, but even that betrayed us. The numbers made sense individually, but not in sequence. Energy was being drawn from us in irregular bursts, not enough to trip alarms, but enough to suggest that the vessel was being studied. We weren't the observers anymore. We were the subject. At 41,800 feet, Nevada came to a full stop, not by command, but by some external force we couldn't measure. The propellers spun without friction, no resistance, no push. We were suspended, hanging like bait in the water. Mitch confirmed all systems nominal, but the readings didn't match our sensory experience. We weren't floating. We were held. Below us, maybe 200 meters down, the structure yawned open, not by mechanical movement, not by visible change, but by shifting perception. The surface parted, or revealed an aperture, or perhaps simply allowed us to notice what had been open all along. A perfect circle, rimmed with symbols that pulsed in harmony with the signal we'd been tracking since the beginning. This wasn't a door made of hinges or thresholds. It was an invitation. Captain Alden gave no verbal order. He simply nodded. Helm engaged forward thrust, and Nevada began its final descent into the unknown. We drifted toward the opening with no resistance. The glow intensified, but not uniformly. It followed our motion, lighting the passage in advance like a system responding to proximity. The moment our bow crossed the perimeter, the lights within the vessel dimmed. Not went out. Dimmed, as if adjusting to match the ambient tone of the environment. The color inside became something otherworldly, a muted blue that shifted with movement. casting shadows that had no origin. Gravity fluctuated. Not violently, but enough that we felt heavier, then lighter, then nothing at all. My stomach floated behind me, then rejoined as we stabilized. The hull stopped creaking. The metal no longer groaned. It was as if the ocean itself had fallen silent, muffled by an atmosphere that wasn't water, wasn't air, but something older, thicker, something that predated our names for things. The interior was massive. The sonar read nothing, dead as if we'd entered a vacuum. But our eyes, those of us still capable of looking, saw it clearly. An enormous chamber, miles across, shaped not like a cavern, but like the atrium of a palace, its scale calculated, its design too symmetrical to be natural. Ribs of metal, or bone, or stone, arced above us in spirals, each intersection marked with glowing points that pulsed like synapses. The walls weren't flat. They moved, not with motion, but with memory. Patterns flowed across them, light shifting like tides beneath glass, symbols morphing into others too quickly to process. And beneath us, a floor of some sort, though we couldn't see it. Only the reflection of our own vessel cast upward, distorted, as if we were looking down into the past and seeing ourselves arriving before we had. Then came the tremor. It wasn't physical. The vessel didn't shake. But every person aboard Nevada flinched at once, breath caught, eyes wide. A compression in thought, a tremor in perception. The kind of internal shift you feel during a fall, or in the moment just before waking from a nightmare. I turned to my console and found it dark, not unpowered, but off, voluntarily. The neural net had disconnected itself, gone into dormant mode. It had stopped listening, or refused to process what it now heard. The passage had taken us in. We had crossed the final line. The door was no longer a location. It was an entity, not alive in the way we understand life, not a creature, but a boundary with will, a presence that had waited uncounted eons for something to draw near. And now, we were inside it. Dave came over the intercom. His voice was slow, uncertain, as though echoing from far away. Engines aren't responding. Reactors stable, but propulsion is off. No thrust, no resistance. Like we're weightless. But we're not drifting. We're stationary relative to something. Something holding us. Mitch confirmed the same from navigation. We're not in a position that can be charted. Nothing to fix to. It's like coordinates don't apply anymore. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. My throat was dry, like I hadn't swallowed in hours. The signal had gone silent. Completely. The rhythmic pulses, so precise and relentless for days, were gone. In their place was only stillness. Not peace. Expectation. Captain Alden appeared beside me without a sound. His eyes were red-rimmed, jaw tight. "How deep are we?" he asked. I looked at the depth gauge. The numbers were blank. No error, no static, just empty. "I don't know," I said. "I don't think we're measuring in feet anymore." He stared at the central display, at the flickering remnants of the last sonar contact we had recorded. A shape, half-rendered. A sphere. A chamber. A mouth. Something waiting at the base of whatever this place was. Something we had not discovered, but awoken. Then, for the first time, I felt it. Not the pressure of water, not the vibration of a signal, but awareness. It passed through the hull like heat through glass. Not violent, not invasive, but searching, curious. A presence older than biology, larger than geography, looking directly at us without moving an inch. It had no name. It had never needed one, but it had known we would come. And now that we had, it was opening. Not a hatch, not a door. Memory. There are moments in a man's life where the division between memory and regret begins to blur, where every breath becomes a negotiation between what you know and what you can never again unknow. The instant that structure responded to us, no, not responded, recognized us, it became clear that we had not stumbled upon it. We had been expected. The moment we reached within 300 meters of the gate-like formation embedded in the seafloor, the pressure outside changed. Not in the measurable sense, but in something deeper, more visceral. The Nevada's hull, rated far beyond anything else in active service, began to vibrate. Not from stress, but from resonance. As if the ship had become a tuning fork and something massive, something ancient, was singing in frequencies not made for ears. The first sound wasn't mechanical. It wasn't anything our instruments could catalog. It was a low, untraceable frequency that bypassed every input and planted itself directly in our nervous systems. A hum that seemed to come from inside our own bones. I remember gripping the console, not from turbulence, but because I felt like I was being peeled open, like thoughts I'd never had were now occupying the same space as my own. No one spoke. Captain Alden paced once, then twice, then leaned over the sonar bay and issued the only command I would later wish had never been spoken aloud. Approach to 100 meters. Hold steady. The Nevada obeyed. And that's when it began. It started with a pulse. Subtle at first, then undeniable. A rhythmic vibration through the water that grew faster, tighter, more precise with every passing second. The trench's walls began to glow, not with bioluminescence, but with a phosphorescent sheen that ran through veins carved in the rock, like blood being pushed through a vascular system too large to be natural. The symbols etched around the arch began to emit light, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the sonar signal we had been chasing. But now, there was no question. The signal wasn't being broadcast. It was being awakened. The pulses increased, then plateaued, then stopped. There was a moment of silence so complete that I thought I had gone deaf. Not a hum, not a breath, not even the soft vibration of the ship's reactor. Nothing. The pressure gauges flatlined. The water temperature dropped 7 degrees in less than 20 seconds. Our internal atmosphere began to condense unnaturally. Fog forming along the edges of consoles, like the inside of the vessel had entered a different climate zone. That's when the structure moved. Not with sound, not with force, but with inevitability. The outer ring of the doorway, previously seamless, began to shift inward. Layers of rock folded back, like petals retracting, revealing a second surface beneath, obsidian-like, smooth as glass, and impossibly black. We had no tools capable of measuring what it was made from. The sonar showed it as a perfect void. No return, no depth. A negative space. Something that swallowed not only light, but intention. It was then that Nevada's systems began to fail, one by one, as if the ship itself was being overwritten. The communications console went first, flickering, then melting down into meaningless symbols, the display glowing with characters none of us could read. Then the reactor status screen began cycling through error codes we'd never seen. And then the lights dimmed, not in a flicker, but like they were being drained, sapped of energy from something beneath us. And in the final moment before the opening completed, I saw it. Just beyond the hull-mounted cameras, the innermost layer of the structure spiraled open like an iris, revealing not a corridor, not a chamber, but a depthless expanse that shimmered like liquid shadow. We had opened something. Or more precisely, something had allowed us to open it. A single tendril of light, thin and sinuous, emerged from the center of that darkness and reached forward, without force, without urgency, toward the Nevada. It touched the hull, not with impact, not with violence. It merely made contact. And in that moment, every instrument aboard ceased to function. The screens went black. The air became thick, not with smoke, but with memory. Scenes that were not ours flooding through the corridors. I saw pyramids, not Egyptian, but something older, rising from oceans that no longer exist. I saw the stars in alignments no longer possible from Earth's rotation. I saw humanoid silhouettes, impossibly tall, walking across crystalline bridges suspended over trenches far deeper than the one we hovered in. And I saw them vanish. Erased, not destroyed. As if their time had run out and something else had replaced them. And then I saw us. Our submarine, the Nevada, surrounded by the same spiraling light, drifting into a chamber not unlike a womb. Timeless, patient, conscious. That's when the pressure returned. Not from the ocean, from within. People began to bleed from the nose and ears. A crewman collapsed in the mess with a scream that split his own throat. Dave vomited uncontrollably into the reactor pit, eyes rolled back as if he were seeing every century of human failure play out behind his eyelids. Captain Alden locked himself in the control room and began to speak in broken whispers to someone who wasn't there. And God help me, I opened the envelope. The card had changed. The ink had shifted. What once read, "Do not transmit, do not speak, do not break eye contact," now said, "It remembers what you are." I don't remember tearing the card. I don't remember screaming. But I remember the ship shuddering. Not from impact, from recognition. We were no longer strangers to this place. We were part of it. The door was open, and it didn't want us to leave. There was no official command, no grand announcement, no final line drawn on a screen. We didn't move forward because of orders. We moved because the world behind us had ceased to exist. Whatever we had come from was already gone, swallowed not by time or distance but by the realization that there was no going back from what we had awakened. The Nevada drifted into the mouth of that impossibility, into the circular chasm that now yawned before us like the open throat of the planet. Not pushed, not pulled, guided, perhaps, as if the vessel had become a bead of dust caught in the breath of something exhaling from below. The edge of the structure passed above our hull without resistance, the blackness around us pressing in without darkness, lit not by light, but by definition itself, being rewritten in real time. Sound ended the moment we crossed. Not reduced, not muted. Simply gone. Even the internal ambience, buzzing electronics, humming airflow, the distant chatter of motors, vanished like it had never existed. We floated in a bubble of silence so total that our own heartbeats became intrusions. It didn't feel like being underwater anymore. It felt like falling through a thought that wasn't ours. The walls of the tunnel, if they could be called that, were neither organic nor mineral, neither metal nor gas. They were formed, clearly shaped by will or memory or something older than design itself. They pulsed in soft gradients of color that had no names, shades that triggered emotions rather than recognition. Dread, awe, grief, familiarity, and some terrible, infantile joy. The kind of joy that doesn't come from understanding, but from reunion. We hadn't just entered the unknown. We had returned to it. And as we moved deeper into that corridor, reality began to bend. Not in ways our instruments could record, but in ways we felt. Shapes on the wall turned as we passed them. Not physically, but perceptually. Angles that shouldn't exist flowed into others. Spaces expanded and contracted in ways that made motion disorienting. You would take 3 steps and find yourself somewhere you hadn't seen before, and yet had always known was waiting. I watched a light fixture in the corridor flicker and then melt, not physically, but logically, its function unraveling until it became a reflection of something that was never meant to be seen. Mitch vomited into his sleeve, collapsing onto the grated floor, muttering a sequence of numbers that later we realized didn't correspond to anything in our system. Dave just stared forward, eyes locked on the viewport as if blinking would break something fragile. I wanted to look away. I couldn't. Outside, the shapes grew clearer. There were markings along the surface, not carvings, but negative space, like symbols extracted from the matter itself. They looped in fractal arrangements, spirals nested within spirals, some too large to see, others so small I felt them moving behind my eyelids. Every few meters the walls opened into alcoves, spaces filled with suspended objects that drifted in place, weightless but unmoving. I saw what looked like the ribcage of something impossibly large, fused with metal. I saw a latticework of crystal that pulsed in time with our own breathing, and when we stopped to hold our breath, it held too. I saw a shape so symmetrical, so perfect, that the longer I stared at it, the more I became convinced it wasn't a shape at all, but a word, written in the language of geometry. As we moved forward, gravity itself began to drift. We would tilt slightly in one direction and never return to center. Liquid in the containment tubes flowed sideways. Even time began to fragment. Our watches desynchronized. I blinked and realized a cup of coffee in my hand had gone cold, even though I had just poured it seconds earlier. Conversations looped. A man passed me in the hallway 3 times in the same minute, never seeing me. I stared into a mirror in the command room and saw myself not as I was, but as a child, wearing the uniform I was issued 30 years later. The boundaries were decaying. And then we reached it. The end of the tunnel, or perhaps the beginning of something else. The corridor terminated in a space so vast our floodlights could not touch the walls. A chamber suspended in gravityless stillness, with no floor, no ceiling, only the echo of movement unmade. In the center hovered a structure, a sphere, a globe of fractured mirrors suspended by nothing, slowly rotating, each pane reflecting something different. Some showed the crew as we were. Others showed us older. Others showed us Wrong. Twisted. Altered. Corrected. Mitch tried to scream. His mouth opened but no sound emerged. His face twisted with pain as his body tried to force air through a world that no longer obeyed the rules of biology. Dave clutched his head and backed into the wall, his eyes bleeding tears of black fluid, and I remember reaching out to steady him and seeing my hand pass through his shoulder, like he was already gone. The Nevada hovered in place, its systems in full diagnostic panic, but no errors were being logged. Nothing was malfunctioning, because function itself had become meaningless. I looked into the sphere and saw myself standing outside the submarine. No suit, no tether, breathing nothing, watching the Nevada from across a distance that didn't exist. I blinked, and I was back inside. Time wasn't flowing here. It was arranging. Around us. Through us. With us. The silence cracked. Not with sound, but with weight. A pressure descended. Not from above or below, but from within. A message. Not spoken. Not transmitted, but understood. We had been let in. Not because we were worthy. Not because we were special. But because we were ready. It had watched us for centuries. It had waited for us to stop looking outward and begin digging down. This place wasn't ancient ruins. It wasn't a city. It wasn't a machine. It was a filter, a threshold, a test, and we had passed. I turned to the captain, but Alden was already gone, his chair empty, still spinning slowly, like he had stood up just moments before, or been removed. One by one, the crew began to vanish. Not with violence, with efficiency. They blinked out of existence like pages turned in a book too quickly read. I stood alone on the command deck, my reflection still visible in the glass. But not just mine. There were others behind me. Shapes, tall and thin, with too many joints and no faces. Watching, remembering, waiting for me to see. And then, in perfect silence, the chamber began to close. There was no clang, no tremor, no mechanical grinding to announce the closing. Just a shifting of space itself, a reweaving of angles and surfaces that no longer obeyed the principles we'd spent our lives pretending were universal. The chamber did not seal like a vault. It folded, like a book closing on a story that hadn't been written yet. And as the Nevada hovered at the edge of that impossible event, we began to feel the full cost of our entry. Not in our lungs or muscles, not in readings or alerts, but in the unbearable sense that the room we were inside was not content to remain a room. It was in the process of becoming something else, and it was using us to do it. The walls of the passage behind us twisted in ways that made the eyes recoil. Not because they moved, but because they refused to be seen the same way twice. I would glance at a corner of the bulkhead and see a right angle, solid and clean. But the moment I turned away, a nausea would bloom behind my eyes and I'd feel certain that it had been a curve, or a spiral, or a slope that led nowhere but had always been there. One of the navigators, I think his name was Ramos, pressed his face too close to the observation glass and began to scream. Not words, just raw, torn sound. Blood poured from his tear ducts, then his mouth, and when we pulled him back, his eyes were frozen wide, pupils shaped like hexagons that kept rotating. He never spoke again. The air grew heavy, not from pressure, but from the accumulation of perspective. The Nevada, though sealed, felt exposed, as if every layer of its hull had been rendered transparent, not to light, but to understanding. Whatever intelligence lived within that space, it had no need to open panels or disable circuits. It simply knew us now, and it began to show us what we were standing inside. The sonar rebooted spontaneously, not by our command, and not with its usual operating system. The screen flickered with static, then filled with diagrams, not scans, not echoes, but illustrations, pulsing geometric renderings of the space outside. Shapes made of line and curvature, overlaid again and again in cascading patterns. Spirals nested in cubes, spheres with angles, tessellations of impossible solids. The longer we looked, the more the lines seemed to move. Not animate, but reveal, as if the shapes were unfolding themselves in reverse, trying to show us how they had once been something comprehensible. The technician monitoring the array, Shu, a calm man from Vancouver who rarely spoke, gasped sharply and stumbled backward. "That's a tesseract," he whispered, pointing at the screen. "But it's not. It's folding into us." He wasn't wrong. The chamber didn't exist to be entered. It existed to filter, to strip us of our frameworks, our definitions, our ability to categorize. It was not designed for life, not even for matter, but for consciousness, a crucible for perception. Every crew member began to experience it differently. Mitch muttered names under his breath, names that weren't his. One of the engineers stared at the ceiling and described cities that didn't exist, down to street names and storefronts, in a language we didn't know he spoke. I caught my own reflection in a surface I didn't recognize, and for a full minute I watched myself age, rapidly, as if years were being condensed into moments. When I blinked, I was still there, still me, but my fingernails were cracked and discolored, and I swear to God my teeth ached with memories that weren't mine. At one point, we tried to backtrack. The propulsion systems re-engaged with minimal response, but as we reversed slowly, it became obvious the passage behind us had changed. It wasn't a tunnel anymore. It was a corridor that bent in on itself. After 50 meters, we looped back into the same chamber. Not similar, the same. We had crossed a threshold that no longer existed in physical space. We weren't inside anything. We were inside a concept. And the concept had no back, no forward, only relevance. Our ship had become a fixed point in a topology that wasn't drawn to scale. It was drawn to memory, and it was warping ours. Dave reported that his bunk was gone. Not messy, not misplaced, gone. When he opened his cabin, it was no longer a room. It was a shaft of pure light leading down, and within it he saw silhouettes reaching upward with arms that split at the elbow. I told him to step back. He said he wasn't afraid, that they were him, and when I turned to check the logs, he was gone. No scream, no sign of struggle, just not there. Somewhere in the process, we stopped using names. The crew ceased to refer to each other as officers or specialists or even people. Not because we lost our minds, but because those words no longer meant anything. The hierarchy dissolved. No one was giving orders. No one was in command. The Nevada, too, had gone silent. Not dead, not malfunctioning, but resigned. Like it, too, had realized it was no longer a vessel of navigation, but a relic drifting inside a dream too vast for movement. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't tell if I'd already slept. Time became inconsistent. A light would flicker and 3 hours would pass. You'd close your eyes to blink and wake up on the floor with a new scar. A woman in engineering, Ensign Wolf, began to paint on the walls using oil from the storage compartment. Shapes, diagrams, scripts that didn't match any known alphabet but burned to look at. She said she wasn't creating them. She was remembering them, that she had written them before, in another descent. I didn't ask what she meant. I couldn't afford to know. And then, as if to reward our unraveling, the chamber began to change again. Not physically, not visually, but perceptually. We began to feel it. Layers, opening inside the space, as if the place we occupied had dimensions beyond comprehension, stacked not like books, but like meanings in a sentence written by something that didn't use language. The symbols outside glowed again. The reflections changed. And one by one, the remaining crew began to point at corners that didn't exist, whispering things like, "There," and "She's waking up," and "We've been here before." But none of them remembered why, and neither did I. By then, it no longer mattered what we believed we had come here to do. The Nevada was no longer a vessel. It was no longer a point in space, nor even a measure of presence. It had become a memory in motion, drifting within a framework that had never been designed to hold matter, only meaning. The geometry we could no longer trust had softened into contours that breathed. Not moved, breathed. We had entered a space carved not from rock or sediment, but from something that possessed pulse and will. I remember waking on the deck floor, my mouth dry with a metallic taste I couldn't place, and realizing the texture beneath my hands was no longer steel. It was warm, faintly pliant, with tiny ridges that responded to the pressure of my fingertips, not recoiling, but acknowledging. When I looked around, no one else reacted, not because they hadn't noticed, but because they no longer questioned. We had gone beyond the boundary where resistance mattered. The Nevada's walls, bulkheads, consoles, everything that once bore the insignia of engineering, had begun to shift. Slightly, subtly, as if something beneath the metal had started replacing the old with the remembered. I pressed my palm to the communication terminal and felt it hum. Not with electricity, but with breath. Faint and rhythmic. Like listening to a sleeping beast through a paper-thin veil. I pulled my hand back and left an impression. The outline of my fingers stayed glowing, not as heat, but as recognition, before dissolving back into the slow, constant pulsation of the living wall. I tried not to panic. It didn't help. Sensors began to fail, but not because they broke. They began returning data that contradicted their design. The infrared camera reported a body temperature of 70 Celsius in an empty hallway. The air pressure console began fluctuating in base 3 intervals. But the environment never changed. And sonar, if it could still be called that, sent back images that resembled skeletons made of coral and metal fused together, suspended just outside the ship. At first, I thought it was interference. Then I thought it was madness. Now, I'm not sure there was a difference. There were things outside, or rather within the outside. Shapes, barely visible in the shimmer of the chamber, walking slowly, never looking up. Their arms hung low, their backs slightly arched forward, and when I adjusted the contrast, their eyes shone like mirrors. Not reflective, absorptive, like each eye was a mouth, and each glance a kind of consumption. We stopped calling it a chamber. That word implied walls, edges, structure. But what we inhabited no longer had those. Instead, we drifted inside something that had been fossilized around its own history. The material, if it was material, had textures we couldn't explain. Sections resembled calloused flesh. Others looked like translucent membranes, veins pulsing just beneath. Some parts of the ceiling glistened with a mucus-like sheen that caught and refracted our lights into patterns that danced across the interior. Not randomly, but with intention. We began to suspect that the patterns were trying to communicate, or warn, or lure. I wasn't sure which terrified me more. I remember one of the crew, O'Donnell, kneeling beside a section of the wall and placing his ear against it. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he turned to me, eyes vacant, and said, "It's singing the names of the cities we forgot." I asked him what he meant, but he was already walking away. Later, we found him curled beneath the primary intake fan, carving glyphs into his own chest with a welding tool. He didn't scream. When we pulled him out, the symbols he had written matched the ones we'd seen pulsating outside the ship. The wall behind engineering began to beat, like a heart, every 14 seconds. Exactly. The frequency increased when we approached the center of the space. I counted them once. It was 54 before I passed out from the pressure. The air wasn't just thicker. It was aware. It moved around us, not randomly, but with resistance and flow, as if guiding us away from certain corners, or toward them. The floor beneath us began to shift with our weight, as though adjusting to balance a burden not physical, but psychological. And then the dreams started, except we weren't sleeping. They came in the middle of sentences, in the middle of routines, sudden invasions of memory that didn't belong to us. I'd be checking an oxygen valve, and then I was on a shoreline I didn't recognize, holding a stone that pulsed like a heartbeat. I'd turn to speak and find my mouth full of sand. Another crew member, Hargrove, claimed to remember the construction of the place. Said he'd been there before, that the structure had been grown, not built, that it had died once, a long time ago, and that our presence was waking it up. I asked him how he could know that. He smiled. Because it told me. We stopped asking questions after that. One day, the mess hall vanished. The bulkhead simply opened into a space that hadn't been there before. A tunnel that wound downward, dripping with condensation that smelled of copper and something sweet. A crew of 3 went in. Only 2 came back. They couldn't remember what happened. But their skin had changed. Thinner, almost translucent in places. One of them had an extra eyelid. The other spoke backwards in her sleep. I began to catalog the changes in the walls. At first they seemed like subtle warping. Then they became anatomical. Rib-like structures rising out of the floor. Valve-like indentations that pulsed as if exhaling. Grooves where bone should be. One stretch of hallway had an arch that resembled a human spine, but elongated by meters and fused with mineral deposits. Not decoration, function. These were not symbols of biology. They were components. The ship was inside something that was not a machine, not an organism, but a process. A process that had learned how to wear stone as a skin, and we had entered through its mouth. The more we tried to leave, the deeper we went. The more we ignored the shapes in the walls, the more they resembled us. By then, only a few of us remained. Or perhaps many more, depending on how you counted. Some were changing, some were reflections. One man bled light when cut. Another had fingernails that grew in spirals. I began to forget my name. But the walls remembered. At first, we thought the pressure was just that. An atmospheric anomaly, the natural response of a sealed space collapsing inward on its own density. A scientific problem, a physical explanation. The sort of thing we'd trained to handle. But this pressure had no unit of measure, no source, no center. It was not pressing on the hull from without, nor crushing us with gravitational force. It was internal. It bloomed behind our eyes, settled into our bones, whispered into the soft spots of our skulls. There were no gauges to track it, no valves to release it, only presence. Only something that had been waiting for us to be quiet enough to hear it. We had passed through noise, through signal, through silence. And now, inside this stillness more complete than vacuum, the voices came. They did not arrive with sound. They arrived as understanding. Not thoughts exactly, but intentions dressed in memory, shaped in the syntax of fear, flowing through our minds in a cadence older than language. They came not one by one, but all at once, like a choir that had waited for centuries for the right audience. The first time I felt it, I was alone near the aft reactor housing, checking a phantom leak. I turned a corner and stopped moving, not from confusion, not from hesitation, but because I realized the thought I'd just had was not mine. I didn't think the words. I knew them. We remember you. That's what it said. That's what they said. The voice had no accent, no age, no emotion, but it carried a gravity of meaning that felt ancient, not hostile, not benevolent, simply inevitable. I stumbled back and fell against the wall, and the wall moved. Not like metal, not like flesh, but like breath recoiling from contamination. I ran, and the corridor changed behind me. When I tried to find the path again later, it was gone, as if it had never existed outside of the moment the voice wanted me to hear. That was when I realized we were no longer navigating this place. We were being led through it, one message at a time. Other crew began reporting similar incidents. They'd blink and feel something settle behind their eyes, like a shadow shifting in the space between thoughts. Then the messages would come. Some were short. You are known. We were always waiting. One of you is the key. Others were entire memories, experienced like dreams, but with no ambiguity. Mitch remembered building a temple with 6 arms and no face. Wolf saw herself raising children underwater, lungs adapted, speaking in harmonics. I saw a city buried beneath a black ocean with no surface, where the buildings pulsed with breath and the sky wept blood. These were not hallucinations. They were communications, intimate and precise, like someone reaching across time to remind us that we had never truly been alone. We tried to isolate the source, but there was no EM activity, no transmissions, no neurological disturbances. The brain scans we took, those of us still willing to run diagnostics, were normal, perfectly normal. That was the most terrifying part. We were not being invaded, we were being accessed, as if something had always been stored inside us and was now being played back. One crewman, Jenkins, had a seizure mid-sentence, and when he woke, he recited a phrase in a language no one recognized. The translator programs failed, but one of the symbols matched the glyphs the walls had shown us. He repeated it once more, calmly, and then stopped breathing. There were other deaths too, quiet ones, peaceful almost, a kind of surrender, no violence, just exit. Some fell asleep and never woke. Others walked into new corridors that weren't supposed to be there and never returned. The Nevada's systems remained intact. Life support still hummed. Power levels were stable. But the ship was no longer a boundary. It had become a shell within a shell, a language within a grammar we had never learned but were now expected to speak fluently. The voices grew clearer, less symbolic, more targeted. I began hearing my own name, not spoken aloud, not echoed through the corridors, but thought directly into the core of who I was. Sometimes in my voice, sometimes in voices I'd forgotten. My mother's, my drill instructor's, my first lover's whisper. They used the scaffolding of my memories to assemble a new voice that felt divine. One night, or what we called night, for time no longer obeyed here. I stood before the observation panel and saw something move in the dark beyond the hull. Not swimming, not floating, drifting with purpose. A shape, enormous and fluid, with limbs that curled and uncurl in mathematical sequence. I felt its presence before I saw it, a recognition that bypassed fear. It pressed close to the window, and I swear I saw eyes. Not staring, not scanning, but listening. It didn't speak with words. It pressed a thought into my spine. You opened the wound. Now you must listen to what bleeds. That was when I realized we weren't trespassers. We weren't explorers. We were answers to a question that had been asked long before we were born. The chamber, the passage, the geometry. It was not a place. It was a receiver, and we were the signal. We were being read, one layer at a time. Every fear, every regret, every decision etched into the soft tissues of our minds like braille for an intelligence that didn't need eyes. Some crew tried to resist. They spoke prayers aloud, built makeshift shrines from broken equipment. One man cut out his own tongue, claiming the voices couldn't enter where speech had been silenced. He was wrong. He bled out slowly, humming something none of us could identify. Others submitted completely. Sat in corners, whispering phrases on loop. One engineer kept drawing eyes on the floor with grease pencils, then arranging her boots so she never stepped on them. She told me stepping on them made it angry. I didn't ask what it was. As for me, I tried to remember who I had been. Not in titles, sonar tech, veteran, father, but in moments. The first time I felt seawater, the sound of my daughter's laugh, the feeling of silence after a storm. But even those began to blur. The voices weren't erasing us. They were replacing the frames, rewriting our meanings. I looked at my reflection once and saw a man I didn't recognize smile at me with my teeth. He looked kind, familiar, patient. But he wasn't me. We were becoming echoes. And the pressure was still rising. We didn't reach the chamber. It reached us. The descent stopped not because we found the end, but because the walls stopped moving. We floated in stillness, not anchored by mass or friction, but by awareness. We were no longer navigating matter. We were navigating attention. The lights aboard the Nevada dimmed slowly until every panel pulsed with a low, amber glow, casting long shadows that didn't obey the contours of the ship. Some of those shadows bent toward the source of light instead of away from it. Others lingered too long after we moved. The darkness no longer waited passively beyond the bulkheads. It moved through the corridors like a tide, choosing which corners of our vessel it would illuminate or obscure. And when the forward viewport opened to reveal what lay beyond, none of us could speak. No orders, no gasps. Only breath held too long in lungs that understood this moment didn't belong to oxygen. The chamber was not a room. It was a wound. Vast, circular, and breathing with a rhythm that didn't align with time, only meaning. Its walls stretched farther than any sonar could reach, too distant to scan, too close to deny. We floated at its edge like dust before a storm, and across its surface ran waves of light. Not reflections, not radiation, but something older. Bioluminescent shapes flowed across the living architecture in pulses, looping like thoughts trying to complete themselves. Colors we couldn't name slid through patterns that felt like grammar, like memory written in light. Every crew member watched, and without discussion, we all knew. This was not a display. This was communication. Not a message to us, but a demonstration through us. It was showing us something it believed we had already known. The walls told a story, not in images, not in motion, but in revelations that unfolded directly into our minds. I saw continents that had never existed sink beneath an ocean I didn't recognize. Not swallowed by water, but embraced by it, as if returning to something that had always claimed them. I saw towers made of bone and glass stretching into a sky of black fire, each one pulsing with blue veins that carried more than blood. They carried memory. Civilizations rose not from soil, but from thought. They didn't build. They grew, dreaming cities into existence through harmonics that bent reality around them like warm wax. And one by one they were consumed, not by war, not by time, but by the return of something they had tried to forget, something beneath. The chamber showed us oceans on fire, skies that screamed, beings without shape, only sound and pressure, coalescing into gods that did not want worship, only silence. I saw figures like us, clad in suits not unlike ours, descending into places like this, in times far removed from our own. Their ships bore different flags, languages lost to extinction. But they had come here too, and they had not returned. One image seared itself into my mind. A creature made of segmented stone and glass, hunched over a pool of black liquid that reflected stars I had never seen. It wept without motion, leaking a golden mist that burned away the surrounding rock as if its sorrow itself was corrosive. I didn't understand it. I remembered it. Not as a scene I'd watched, but as something I'd once lived. As if I had stood in that place, in that form, at the end of a time that had not yet happened. The chamber pulsed, and another layer unfolded. It showed us Earth. Not the Earth we knew, but a version half recognized. Its continents split differently, its cities unfamiliar, but the rhythm of its sky identical. We saw ourselves, not as individuals but as a species. Our wars, our monuments, our delusions. We watched as we sent probes into the stars and refused to look downward. We watched as something beneath the crust reached up, not maliciously, not violently, but curiously. And we recoiled. We built weapons. We lied to ourselves. We drowned it in noise, in time, in forgetting. And the voices had waited, because forgetting was never permanent. Not to them. Memory is a loop, and they had learned to survive in its quiet corners. Buried, dormant, until something with the right frequency came close enough to listen. And we had listened. We had followed the pattern. We had touched the threshold. And so they opened themselves, not as punishment, not as invasion, but as revelation, to remind us that the deep was not below. The deep was within. Wolf collapsed during the vision. She curled into herself, whispering a child's rhyme about rain and silver hair over and over. Mitch held his head in his hands and screamed until blood poured from his nose. I sat still, because I couldn't move. My body was there, but my awareness was elsewhere. I was watching the rise and fall of species I had never seen, feeling their extinction like phantom pain. I felt myself dissolve into a library of forgotten lives, each of us a page, and the chamber was reading us aloud. The story ended without conclusion. The lights dimmed, the patterns slowed. The pressure receded just enough to let us breathe again without weeping. But it had given us everything it wanted to give. Not truth, not history. Warning. We were not special. We were not chosen. We were simply the most recent to stumble close enough to the wound for it to bleed into us. And now, whether we escaped or not, we would carry it. We had become transmitters. Memory would flow through us into the next ears willing to listen. Because forgetting was never the end. It was only the invitation. There are shapes the human mind cannot behold without rewriting itself. That is the only way I've learned to describe what stood, no, existed, at the center of the chamber. It had no defined form, and yet it eclipsed space around it. Like a bruise in the fabric of being, it absorbed motion and refracted thought. It was not just a presence. It was a contradiction. At once still and infinite, silent, but louder than any scream I'd ever buried in my lungs. When the lights dimmed and the walls exhaled one final breath, it emerged from the folds of the architecture not by walking or unfolding, but by being noticed. It had always been there, but only now had we become slow and fractured enough to see it. It moved, but not in steps. It transitioned between existing and not existing, never in sequence. Wherever I tried to focus, it wasn't. Wherever I glanced peripherally, it flourished. The bulk of it seemed mineral, formed from impossible joints and arc segments that shimmered in and out of phase with the pulsing walls. And yet, there was skin. Not flesh in any terrestrial sense, but layers of coalesced history, striations of memory compressed into a surface that glowed faintly like moonlight bleeding through bone. Around what might have been its head, if such anatomy applied, floated a corona of translucent limbs or tendrils, each swaying not to any current, but to rhythm, as if syncing with the minds of those who observed it. The others dropped to their knees, not out of reverence, not even fear, just necessity, as if their bodies instinctively folded under the weight of contact with something older than time. Mitch clawed at his face until blood ran freely over his chin. Wolf sobbed silently into her palms, tears mixing with saliva in an expression not of pain, but of recognition. I stood, Not out of courage, not out of resistance, only because it hadn't told me to fall. And when it turned toward me, or rather, when its attention descended upon me like the floor giving out beneath a dream, I felt everything I had ever done collapse into a single filament of meaning. I was not judged. I was known. There were no words. There was no sound. But the sensation, raw, unrelenting, invasive, drenched every cell of my consciousness. It searched me, not like a scan, not like interrogation. It peeled, thought by thought, regret by regret, decision by dormant wound. I felt myself unravel in strands of memory, each one presented not as guilt or shame, but as specimen. I watched the death of my brother all over again, his body shattered under the weight of metal and water, my hand still gripping the sonar throttle, frozen. I heard my daughter's voice on the last call I ignored, too focused on protocol to ask why she had cried before hanging up. I relived moments I had buried so deeply I had forgotten they'd ever been mine. The entity showed them all to me at once, not cruelly, but with the patience of an archivist unfolding pages long forgotten. And then, without transition, I saw its memories. Not in sequence, not in images. In feelings pressed into my blood. I felt what it was like to be awake when the ocean was young. To remember the pressure before water knew how to hold shape. I tasted the silence of the earth before light learned to bend. It remembered firestorms before tectonics. It remembered others, creatures like itself, but not the same, each one a node in a network that stretched across aeons. Together they shaped currents not with hands, but with intention, weaving thought into crust, memory into magma. They weren't gods, they were custodians. But the world moved on, and the network fell quiet, one by one, until only it remained, waiting, dormant, beneath layers of rock, awaiting the right pattern to reawaken what had been forgotten. We were not the first. It showed me others, beings from skies we've never mapped, civilizations buried not in sand, but in the folds of perception. Ships like ours, crewed by eyes that blinked sideways, voices that vibrated bone. They came searching too, drawn by the signal, seduced by the echo of understanding. And each time, it showed them the same thing, the truth of recursion. That memory cannot die, only delay. That meaning circles back upon itself. And that to witness the chamber, to see the entity, was to become a conduit for what must be remembered. That was its only function. It did not kill. It did not protect. It ensured transmission. The price of entering the threshold was to carry the imprint of what lay beyond it, to return to the world above as a vessel, empty of certainty, but full of knowing. Behind me, the Nevada groaned. The hull had begun to shift. It had taken on the rhythm of the chamber, its geometry warping into sync with what pulsed beneath. The ship would never sail again. It had been rewritten. Some part of it, some self of it, had been absorbed. And so had some of us. Wolf was on the floor, still breathing, but glassy-eyed and murmuring equations in a language not from Earth. Mitch's mouth was open, jaw slack, as if speaking to something only he could see. I was still standing, but I no longer felt my legs. The entity began to recede, not turning, not retreating, just fading into the curvature of space behind it, like a painting sinking into its own canvas. And yet, the weight of it remained. The pressure, the resonance. It had shown us what we were meant to see. Not prophecy, not salvation, just truth. And truth doesn't ask permission. It leaves its mark. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had known. Not the absence of sound, not the stillness of airless void or the compression of depth, but a withdrawal, as if sound itself had been erased, not just muffled but excised from possibility. The chamber had finished with us. The entity, if it could even be called that, had receded into the curvature of knowing, leaving behind only resonance, the faint taste of memory that wasn't ours, and a weight that lived just behind the eyes. We were still inside the Nevada, still surrounded by metal and blinking panels and the illusion of control. But something fundamental had changed. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a witness. It pulsed faintly beneath our feet, with a rhythm that had not come from any reactor or engine room. I could feel it in the soles of my boots, like a heartbeat that had nothing to do with life. Wolf had stopped murmuring, her eyes now closed, head tilted back as if in prayer or surrender. Mitch was gone. Not dead. Gone. I remember blinking, looking away for a second, maybe two, and when I turned back his seat was empty. No trace of him. No motion. No sound. No breath. Just the faint shimmer of something molecular that lingered too long in the air where he had been. He'd been taken, or dissolved, or absorbed. I don't know. None of the words feel right, but none of the old ones do anymore. We should have moved then. Should have retreated. Should have started engines or prayed or screamed or done anything. But we didn't. We sat in that quiet that wasn't quiet and waited to feel again. It took time. Too much of it, I think. But eventually the instruments flickered. Not in failure, not in chaos, in alignment. Like the systems were syncing with a frequency deeper than mechanics. The sonar screen lit first. No signal. Just static that pulsed like breath. Then the navigation screen came online, displaying no known coordinates, only a single point marked by an old Navy distress code that hadn't been used since before my enlistment. Its meaning was simple. It meant no surface. The engines hummed once. Then again. I remember touching the throttle and feeling it recoil. Not with resistance, but with a sensation I can only describe as disinterest. As if the ship itself had outgrown our hands. And then the tremor began. At first it was gentle, like the whole structure inhaling. The chamber's walls began to pulse again, but slower this time, dimmer. Something was shifting, receding, or awakening. I don't know which, but the sense was unmistakable. We were not meant to be here anymore. Whatever threshold had allowed us in had begun to close. Not with violence, but with certainty. Panels groaned. Fluid systems vented in spirals instead of pressure bursts. The hull's outer shell began to shimmer, not buckle. Something external, immense, deliberate, aware, was tightening around us. From the bridge window I saw it. A tendril or limb, not made of flesh or cable or stone, but of fused memory, curving and flexing like an idea-made material. It was rising from the chamber floor, slow and colossal, and it had begun to coil itself around the Nevada's midsection. Not to crush us, not to hold us, to claim us. I tried to override the navigation lockout, but the console displayed only the symbol we'd seen on the chamber wall, a circle with 7 asymmetrical lines breaking outward like fractures from a wound. Wolf began to sob, not from fear, I think, but from understanding, the kind that doesn't need language. She whispered something under her breath, I couldn't catch it, and pressed her hand against the floor. She looked up at me then, smiled, peacefully, then walked into the central corridor and disappeared down the passage toward the airlock. I didn't stop her. I knew I couldn't. She was answering a call I hadn't heard yet. The arm, or root, or thought, wrapped fully around us. The lights inside the ship shifted hue, first to a deep violet, then to the red of blood behind eyelids. Gravity twisted. Not violently, but unreliably. I felt my own body lengthen and shrink, like my mind couldn't decide how tall I was. I tasted salt in my nose and iron in my throat. The controls melted into meaningless shapes. The ceiling seemed to move closer, but I knew it hadn't. I was no longer in control of my own perspective. I don't remember the moment the hull gave way. I remember after, floating through a cavity where rooms used to be, surrounded by fragmented echoes of conversation and alarm. A wrench drifted past me, spinning slowly, then stopped mid-air and shattered into powder. A photograph, one of the crew's daughters, hovered weightless beside me, then folded in on itself like it was being rewritten. The air thinned, the temperature plummeted, then surged. All systems lost meaning. The ship groaned one last time, not mechanically, but mournfully, like it was saying goodbye to itself. And then I saw light. Not ahead, not behind, through me. It poured in from every direction, like liquid memory. The chamber was gone. The Nevada was gone. The pressure was gone. But something remained. Me. Alone, or almost. I came to inside a decompression pod, far from the wreck, floating adrift in black water, my suit's oxygen reading functional but unearned. 2 other pods blinked faint green nearby. Only 2. Wolf. Someone else. I don't know who. We never spoke again. The retrieval team found us 90 hours later, unconscious, barely alive, our logs corrupted, our systems unreadable, the Nevada untraceable. They said we'd been 30 miles from our last ping. We hadn't. We were somewhere else. Somewhere beneath. And no one believed us. But they didn't have to, because we had brought something back. I awoke to sterile light. Fluorescent white bleeding from a ceiling too smooth, too perfect, humming faintly with that low-frequency pitch only military facilities still cling to. I recognized the timbre before I opened my eyes. Naval Infirmary. Stateside. East Coast, probably. Groggy disorientation gave way to a sharper, more deliberate kind of numbness, the kind they manufacture with chemicals. Something cold pulsed in my arm. Monitors beeped softly in a rhythm I knew wasn't natural. I was alive somehow, which was the first impossibility. The second came when I tried to speak and found that my mouth responded, but no one was listening. There was no nurse, no chatter, only the presence of silence wearing the uniform of calm. The kind of quiet reserved for classified wings and unwanted witnesses. My throat rasped. I asked for water. The request went unanswered for hours. When it came, it was delivered by a man in black, not Navy, not even DOD. Civilian shell, Intelligence Corps. His badge meant nothing. His silence meant everything. He didn't introduce himself. He sat beside the bed and laid a folder on my lap without preamble. It was thin, cream-colored, plain. My name was typed at the top in bold black. Beneath it, a list of identifiers: rank, clearance, psychological profile. I flipped the page. A statement of debrief. Not what happened, but what didn't. According to the document, the USS Nevada never existed. The mission was never launched. I had been assigned to a sonar calibration routine off the coast of Guam, during which I experienced a brief period of physiological disorientation, resulting in hallucinations and transient amnesia. There were medical scans to support this claim. Doctored, I could tell, but convincing enough for a boardroom. A second page detailed a non-disclosure agreement. The language was precise, aggressively legal. I was to speak of none of it. Not to family, not to therapists, not even to ranking officers. Violation meant criminal prosecution under a clause that had been redacted. The folder came with a pen. No pressure. No threat. Just inevitability. I asked about the others. He didn't blink. Didn't breathe, I think. Just said, there were no others. I named Wolf. He tilted his head slightly, as if processing the word like a foreign language, then repeated, there were no others. I asked if I was the only survivor. He corrected me. You were the only one recovered. A difference I didn't want to examine too closely. I asked what they found at the site. He said the sonar data was corrupted. I asked again. He said there was nothing to find. The floor of the trench had collapsed. No structural remnants. No distress signal. No logs. No black box. No Nevada. Just water. Cold, deep, and empty. I signed. Of course I signed. Not because I accepted the lie, but because I understood the futility of resistance. They didn't want silence. They wanted containment. This wasn't about national security. It wasn't even about secrecy. It was about memory management. What we'd seen. What we'd touched. It wasn't a threat they could neutralize. It was a story they needed to erase from causality. And we were pages in that story. They couldn't burn the book, but they could smudge the ink. I was debriefed for 6 days in a windowless room. Each time by a different person. Each time asked the same questions in slightly different phrasings. They monitored eye dilation, pulse, micro-expressions. One man dropped a photo in front of me during session 3. It showed a sonar printout from a mission dated 1991. Same pattern. Same impossible depth. I asked where it was taken. He slid it back into a folder and said nothing. I was released without fanfare, no commendation, no record. As far as the Navy was concerned, I had completed a routine 2-week sonar maintenance shift and been treated for mild decompression sickness. They let me keep my rank, my pension, even gave me an honorable discharge, but they took something else. Every device I owned was seized for inspection. My apartment had been entered, though they denied it. My personal logs, backups, photos, gone. They left behind just enough to preserve the illusion of continuity. Friends stopped answering my calls. Former shipmates vanished from databases. It was as if I had served in a war that was never declared, fought in a place that geography refused to acknowledge. Wolf was gone. No obituary. No missing person report. No family contacts. I visited her last known address. A mailbox full of unclaimed letters. Neighbors who claimed she moved away months before deployment. I didn't press. I knew the pattern. Mitch's name didn't appear in any crew roster. I found one online article about a naval contractor found dead in a motel room outside San Diego. Dental records withheld, that's all. They were wiping the trail, not just to protect the mission, but to protect the idea that it ever occurred. That anything could exist down there outside the grasp of cartography and comprehension. I kept the pen they gave me. Black, unbranded, heavy. It writes too smoothly. I use it to record what I remember in notebooks I hide beneath floorboards. Not for publication, not even for vindication. Just to remind myself that it happened, that I was there, that it wasn't a delusion, even if that's the most merciful explanation. Sometimes I dream of the chamber. Sometimes I feel the pulse again in my wrist, like a distant heartbeat, not my own. Sometimes I think the light left something inside me, not alive, not dangerous, just awake, waiting, like it always does. There was one last form I was given. It was a waiver of acknowledgement. Not legal, not mandatory. Just a signature to confirm I had been made aware of the psychological effects of deep-sea disorientation, and that I accepted that any recollection deviating from the official record was the result of stress, trauma, and hallucination. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I signed it too. But I didn't write my name. I wrote the symbol I saw on the chamber wall. The circle. The fractures. The wound. The man in black took the paper. Didn't flinch. Didn't speak. But for a fraction of a second, I swear he smiled. I had almost convinced myself it was over. That whatever had been awakened beneath the ocean's skin had sunk back into sleep, back into the folds of geology and myth. That my silence had done what they wanted, contained it, diluted it, entombed it beneath paperwork and sedation. I kept to myself, moved inland, built routines from scratch. Coffee at 7, a walk before noon, checking the mail I never expected to contain anything. I let my beard grow, canceled old accounts, refused interviews. I became a ghost inside a country I had once sworn to serve. I buried the notebooks beneath the floorboards of a rental cabin that didn't even have a proper address. On good days, I could almost convince myself I was healing, that nothing had followed me out of that depth except memory. But memory is not a relic. It's a vector. It carries. It incubates. And it returns. Always. It started with a news story I wasn't meant to see. A headline buried on a geological survey blog of all places. Unusual sonar readings off the coast of Namibia. Deep water anomaly. No seismic activity. A few experts speculated about methane release or plate shift. But the image attached, a grainy spectrogram, told another story. I recognized the pattern instantly. It wasn't a geological tremor. It was a signal. The same one I had heard before. The one that changed everything. The one that started it all. I clicked on the article. It had already been pulled. I found a cached version through a proxy. The coordinates listed weren't exact, but they pointed to a trench I had never heard of. Unnamed. Unmapped. Just like before. And just like before, the anomaly pulsed at regular intervals. Too symmetrical for nature. Too deep for accident. I sat there for an hour, staring at the waveform. My hands trembled. My coffee went cold. I told myself not to look further. That it wasn't my problem anymore. That I had done my part and survived what no one else did. But curiosity is not the opposite of fear. It is its twin. I dug. Forums, sonar logs, whistleblowers, private contractors, all leading to one thing. Someone had heard the pulse again. Not once. Not twice. Dozens of times over the last 4 months. Different places, same structure. Always near the edge of mapped trenches. Always dismissed as equipment error or underwater interference. Except the pattern never changed. 7 breaks. 1 cycle. The wound. I contacted no one. I couldn't risk it. Not after what happened to Wolf, to Mitch, to the entire crew of the Nevada. But I started recording again. Not in notebooks, not on cloud drives. I carved the sequence into wood, into stones I kept in a locked box. I etched them under drawers, behind mirrors. I became obsessed with replication. Not because I thought I could warn anyone, but because I felt responsible. As if I had brought something back with me that needed a shape, a language. I started dreaming of the chamber again, but now it was changing, expanding, as if it had grown in my absence. Sometimes I could see others walking inside it, Figures not from memory, but from now. People who had never been on the Nevada. Scientists. Divers. Soldiers. I'd wake up gasping for breath with salt in my nose, my ears ringing with pressure that shouldn't exist above sea level. Then came the package. No return address, plain cardboard. Inside, a single flash drive. No message, no note, just a name written in permanent marker. Rennick. I hadn't used that name in years. My heart sank. I nearly threw it into the fire, but I didn't. I plugged it into an old offline laptop I hadn't booted in months. It contained one file, video, time-stamped 3 weeks ago, grainy, recorded from inside a control room. Audio was distorted, but the image was clear. Sonar display. Same waveform. Same frequency. And then, faintly in the background, whispers. Not mechanical, not electronic. Voices. Human, almost. But layered. Wrong. Like echoes caught in a spiral. And then a flash. The screen flared white. The recording ended. That was it. 70 seconds of terror. But it was all I needed. It wasn't over. It had never been. The passage hadn't closed. They hadn't sealed anything. They had only delayed it, moved the frequency, redirected the invitation. But now it was broadcasting again, stronger, clearer, more frequent. And someone, somewhere, had answered. I could feel it in the air. The static, the electricity beneath ordinary sound, the vibration in the bones, the entity. We had not witnessed its awakening, only its notice. We were not the first, and we would not be the last. It had always been there. It had always waited. Now, it was reaching out, testing, learning, calling. The nightmares returned with force. No longer just glimpses of the chamber, but sequences. Journeys, dreams of descent. Through impossible tunnels of light and muscle. Through silence that screamed and geometry that bled. I would wake sweating, unable to speak, hearing sonar pulses in the humming of the refrigerator. I dismantled everything in my house, replaced all light bulbs with red lamps, blocked windows, covered mirrors, not for protection, for focus. I began to prepare. I don't know for what. A return? A confrontation? A collapse? Or maybe I already knew. It was never a one-way passage. What we opened was not just a door. It was an aperture of memory, a recursion of knowing. It doesn't close, because it is closure. It is the fold at the edge of time where matter and intention meet. The entity was never locked away. It was preserved, waiting for something, maybe someone, to find it again and bring it back into thought. We were conduits. We are always conduits. And now it's awake. And now it's listening. And now it's here.